it's a trap. Welcome back to my channel. Hello if you are new. I have attempted to stream reading while knitting, and I have had audio issues for all of them. The first one I sounded like a robot because I had two audio inputs set to the same thing, so there was a slight echo. And I could listen to it, but it's me, so like I was okay with it. It's not up to my standards for making other people sit through. Then I attempted to read the next couple of chapters and then go back and redo where I react to stuff. So yeah, now instead of I'll probably stream in the future, but for now, since I have now read the first chapter 3 times, about to be 4, this is just going to be a recorded episode and in the new format. So I need a new graphics card, and I'm limited as far as what games I can play while recording with my current graphics card. It is very quickly becoming not obsolete, because obviously I can still use it just fine, but in order to handle recording and playing, I need a heftier graphics card than what I currently have. So in the meantime, what I decided to do, since I can just do one or the other, I would just record, but I would record myself knitting and reading. There are a ton of books that are available in the public domain. ProjectGutenberg.org has over 70,000 free ebooks, and you can get them in a variety of different formats as far as like the files go. I'm reading on a Kindle app for my computer. You can get the Kindle app for a lot of different platforms. It's not just, for Kindle or just for Amazon products. Anyhow, that's how I'll be reading, but Project Gutenberg has a whole bunch of different options. So if you're not if you don't want to use Kindle and potentially, support it, you're not supporting the Bezos, but if you don't want to use an Amazon product, there's alternatives. That's all I mean. Anyway, I am going to be reading for you Agatha Christie, the queen of the murder mystery. One of her books recently came into public domain. It was either early this year or late last year. And it's called The Secret of Chimneys. We'll find out what Chimneys is in the second or third chapter, I think. And so I'm going to do 2 videos that I'll record back to back here today. We'll do chapters 1 and 2, and then chapters 3 and 4. They are relatively short chapters, and I will be knitting during them. I realize I could have been knitting this entire time talking to you, but anyhow, I'm working on a blanket for my sister. Don't tell her. And this is, if you're at all familiar with knitting, this is called garter stitch. So this nice, squishy, bumpy, it's the same on both sides. This is the wrong side, so you can see where I switched colors down here. I love garter stitch because I don't have to pay attention to it, and my hands know what to do with muscle memory. So it's pretty great for this particular format. And this particular pattern, I'm just knitting until I run out of color, and then I switch to the next stripe. So I've got plenty of blue to get us through. There's a comparison. I've got plenty of blue to get through. This is the second of 2 balls or skeins. And yeah, so that's enough of an intro. Let's get to reading. Chapter 1, Anthony Cade signs on. Gentleman Joe! Why, if it isn't old Jimmy McGrath. Castle Selector, represented by 7 depressed-looking females and 3 perspiring males, looked on with considerable interest. Evidently there Mr. McCade had met an old friend. They all admired Mr. McCade so much, his tall, lean figure, his sun-tanned face, the light-hearted manner with which he settled disputes and cajoled them all into good temper. This friend of his now, surely rather a peculiar-looking man, about the same height as Mr. McCade, but thick-set and not nearly so good-looking. The sort of man one read about in books, who probably kept a saloon. Interesting, though. After all, that was what one came abroad for, to see all these peculiar things one read about in books. Up to now, they had been rather bored with Bulawayo. The sun was unbearably hot, the hotel was uncomfortable, there seemed to be nowhere particular to go until the moment should arrive to motor to the Matapos. Very fortunately, Mr. Cade had suggested picture postcards. There was an excellent supply of picture postcards. Anthony Cade and his friend had stepped a little apart. "What the hell are you doing with this pack of females?" demanded McGrath. "Starting a harem?" "Not with this lot," grinned Anthony. "Have you taken a good look at them?" "I have that. Thought you were losing your eyesight." "My eyesight's as good as it ever was. No, this is a Castle Selector. I'm Castle. The local Castle, I mean. What the hell made you take on a job like that?" "A regrettable necessity for cash. I can assure you it doesn't suit my temperament." Jimmy grinned. "Never a hog for regular work, were you?" Anthony ignored this aspersion. "However, something will turn up soon, I expect," he remarked hopefully. "It usually does." Jimmy chuckled. "If there's anything brewing, Anthony Cade is sure to be in it sooner or later. I know that," he said. "You've an absolute instinct for rows, and the 9 lives of a cat. When can we have a yarn together?" Anthony sighed. "I've got to take these cackling hens to see Rhodes' grave." "That's the stuff," said Jimmy approvingly. "They'll come back bumped black and blue with the ruts in the road, and clamoring for bed to rest the bruises on. Then you and I will have a spot or two and exchange the news." "Right. So long, Jimmy." Anthony rejoined his flock of sheep. Miss Taylor, the youngest and most skittish of the party, instantly attacked him. "Oh, Mr. Cade, was that an old friend of yours?" "It was Miss Taylor, one of the friends of my blameless youth." Miss Taylor giggled. "I thought he was such an interesting-looking man. I'll tell him you said so." "Oh, Mr. Cade, how can you be so naughty?" "The very idea. What was the name he called you?" "Gentleman Joe." "Yes. Is your name Joe?" "I thought you knew it was Anthony, Miss Taylor." "Oh, go on with you," cried Miss Taylor coquettishly. Anthony by now had well mastered his duties. In addition to making the necessary arrangements of travel, they included soothing down irritable old gentlemen when their dignity was ruffled, seeing that elderly matrons had ample opportunities to buy picture postcards, and flirting with everything under a Catholic 40 years of age. The last task was rendered easy for him by the extreme readiness of the ladies in question to read a tender meaning into his most innocent remarks. Miss Taylor returned to the attack. "Why does he call you Joe, then?" "Oh, just because it isn't my name." "And why Gentleman Joe?" "The same kind of reason." "Oh, Mr. Cade," protested Miss Taylor, much distressed. "I'm sure you shouldn't say that. Papa was only just saying last night what gentlemanly manners you had. Very kind of your father, I'm sure, Miss Taylor. And we all agreed you are quite the gentleman. I'm overwhelmed." "No, really, I mean it." "Kind hearts are more than coronets," said Anthony vaguely, without a notion of what he meant by the remark. He had a notion of what he meant by the remark, wishing fervently it was lunchtime. "That's such a beautiful poem, I always think. Do you know much poetry, Mr. Cade?" "I might recite 'The boy stood on the burning deck' at a pinch." "The boy stood on a burning deck, whence all but he had fled." That's all I know, but I can do that with a bit of action, if you like. "The boy stood on the burning deck." Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The flames, you see. "Whence all but he had fled." For that bit I run to and fro like a dog. Miss Taylor screamed with laughter. "Oh, do look at Mr. Cade, isn't he funny?" "Time for morning tea," said Anthony briskly. "Come this way. There is an excellent cafe in the next street." "I presume," said Mrs. Caldecott in her deep voice, "that the expense is included in the tour." "Morning tea, Mrs. Caldecott," said Anthony, assuming his professional manner, "is extra." "Disgraceful." "Life is full of trials, isn't it?" said Anthony cheerfully. Mrs. Caldecott's eyes gleamed, and she remarked, with the air of one springing a mine, "I suspected as much, and in anticipation I poured off some tea into a jug at breakfast this morning. I can heat that up on the spirit lamp. Come, father." Mr. and Mrs. Caldecott sailed off triumphantly to the hotel, the ladies back complacent with successful forethought. "Oh, Lord," muttered Anthony, "what a lot of funny people it does take to make a world." He marshaled the rest of the party in the direction of the cafe. Miss Taylor kept by his side and resumed her catechism. "Is it a long time since you saw your friend?" "Just over 7 years." "Was it in Africa you knew him?" "Yes, not this part, though. First time I ever saw Jimmy McGrath, he was all trussed up." And then we say some things that are not really kosher. They're not really great to say anymore. This book was written in 1925, and I'm going to skip anything that I know of or suspect as being problematic. However, I may miss something, and if I do, please let me know. I apologize in advance. And so we're just going to skip ahead of just a few lines, because he has some stereotypes about Indigenous people that he goes into, and we just don't need to do that. It doesn't matter for this story. "Oh, Mr. Cade, what an adventurous life you must have led. Very peaceful, I assure you." But it was clear that the lady did not believe him. It was about 10 o'clock that night when Anthony Cade walked into the small room where Jimmy McGrath was busy manipulating various bottles. "Make it strong, James," he implored. "I can tell you I need it." "I should think you did, my boy. I wouldn't take on that job of yours for anything." "Show me another, and I'll jump out of it fast enough." McGrath poured out his own drink, tossed it off with a practiced hand, and mixed a second one. Then he said slowly, "Are you in earnest about that, old son?" "About what?" "Chucking this job of yours if you could get another." "Why, you don't mean to say that you've got a job gone begging. Why don't you grab it for yourself?" "I have grabbed it, but I don't much fancy it. That's why I'm trying to pass it on to you." Anthony became suspicious. "What's wrong with it? They haven't engaged you to teach in a Sunday school, have they?" "Do you think anyone would choose me to teach in a Sunday school?" "Not if they knew you well, certainly." "It's a perfectly good job. Nothing wrong with it whatsoever." "Not in South America by any lucky chance. I've rather got my eye on South America. There's a very tidy little revolution coming off in one of those republics soon." McGrath grinned. "You always were keen on revolutions and anything to be mixed up in a really good row." "I feel my talents might be appreciated out there. I tell you, Jimmy, I can be jolly useful in a revolution to one side or the other. It's better than making an honest living any day." "I think I've heard that sentiment from you before, my son. No, the job isn't in South America. It's in England." "England? Return of the hero to his native land after many long years? They can't dun you for bills after 7 years, can they, Jimmy?" "I don't think so." "Well, are you on for hearing more about it?" "I'm on all right. The thing that worries me is why you're not taking it on yourself." "I'll tell you. I'm after gold, Anthony, far up in the interior." Anthony whistled and looked at him. "You've always been after gold, Jimmy, ever since I knew you. It's your weak spot, your own particular little hobby. You've followed up more wild cat trails than anyone I know. And in the end I'll strike it, you'll see." "Well, everyone his own hobby. Mine's rows, yours is gold." "I'll tell you the whole story. I suppose you know all about Herzoslovakia." Anthony looked up sharply. "Herzoslovakia," he said, with a curious ring in his voice. "Yes. Know anything about it?" There was quite an appreciable pause before Anthony answered. Then he said slowly, Only what everyone knows. It's one of the Balkan states, isn't it? Principal rivers? Unknown. Principal mountains? Also unknown, but fairly numerous. Capital? Ekarest. Population? Chiefly brigands. Hobby? Assassinating kings and having revolutions. Last king, Nicholas IV, assassinated about 7 years ago. Since then, it's been a republic. Altogether, a very likely spot. You might have mentioned before that Slovakia came into it. It doesn't, except indirectly. Anthony gazed at him more in sorrow than in anger. You ought to do something about this, James, he said. Take a correspondence course or something. If you told a story like this in the good old Eastern days, you'd have been hung up by the heels and bastinadoed, or something equally unpleasant. Jimmy pursued his course, quite unmoved by these strictures. Ever heard of Count Stilptich? Now you're talking, said Anthony. Many people who have never heard of Slovakia would brighten at the mention of Count Stilptich. The grand old man of the Balkans, the greatest statesman of modern times, the biggest villain unhung. The point of view all depends on which newspaper you take in. But be sure of this, Count Stilptich will be remembered long after you and I are dust and ashes, James. Every move and countermove in the Near East for the last 20 years had Count Stilptich at the bottom of it. He's been a dictator and a patriot and a statesman, and nobody knows exactly what he has been, except that he's been a perfect king of intrigue. Well, what about him? He was prime minister of Slovakia, that's why I mentioned it first. You've no sense of proportion, Jimmy. Slovakia is of no importance at all compared to Stilptich. It just provided him with a birthplace and a post in public affairs. But I thought he was dead. So he is. He died in Paris about 2 months ago. What I'm telling you about happened some years ago. The question is, said Anthony, what are you telling me about? Jimmy accepted the rebuke and hastened on. It was like this. I was in Paris just 4 years ago, to be exact. I was walking along one night in rather a lonely part when I saw 6 French toughs beating up a respectable-looking old gentleman. I hate a one-sided show, so I promptly butted in to beat up the toughs. I guess they'd never been hit really hard before. They melted like snow. Good for you, James, said Anthony softly. I'd like to have seen that scrap. Oh, it was nothing much, said Jimmy modestly, but the old boy was no end grateful. He'd had a couple, no doubt about that, but he was sober enough to get my name and address out of me, and he came along and thanked me next day. Did the thing in style, too. That was when I found out it was Count Stilptich I'd rescued. He'd got a house up by the Bois. Anthony nodded. Yes, Stilptich went to live in Paris after the assassination of King Nicholas. They wanted him to come back and be president later, but he wasn't taking any. He remained sound to his monarchical principles, though he was reported to have his finger in all the backstairs pies that went on in the Balkans. Very deep, the late Count Stilptich. Nicholas IV was the man who had a funny taste in wives, wasn't he? Said Jimmy suddenly. Yes, said Anthony, and did it for him too, poor beggar. She was some little gutter snipe of a music hall artiste in Paris, not even suitable for a morganatic alliance. But Nicholas had a frightful crush on her, and she was all out for being a queen. Sounds fantastic, but they managed it somehow. Called her the Countess Popovsky, or something, and pretended she had Romanov blood in her veins. Nicholas married her in the cathedral at Ekarest with a couple of unwilling archbishops to do the job. She was crowned as Queen Veraga. Nicholas squared his ministers, and I suppose he thought that was all that mattered. But he forgot to reckon with the populace. They're very aristocratic and reactionary in Slovakia. They like their kings and queens to be the genuine article. There were mutterings and discontent, and the usual ruthless suppressions. And the final uprising, which stormed the palace, murdered the king and queen, and proclaimed a republic. It's been a republic ever since, but things still manage to be pretty lively there, so I've heard. They've assassinated a president or two just to keep a hand in. But revenons à nos moutons. You had got to where Count Stilptich was hailing you as his preserver. Yes, well, that was the end of that business. I came back to Africa. Sorry, I'm looking at this yarn here. It must be where they joined some... They must have joined like multiple strands or something right there. There it is. Yeah. I thought I had messed up. But no, it's the yarn from the mill. Okay. Yes, well, that was the end of that business. I came back to Africa and never thought of it again until about 2 weeks ago. I got a queer-looking parcel which had been following me all over the place for the Lord knows how long. I'd seen in a paper that Count Stilptich had recently died in Paris. Well, this parcel contained his memoirs or reminiscences, or whatever you call the things. There was a note enclosed to the effect that if I delivered the manuscript at a certain firm of publishers in London on or before October 13th, they were instructed to hand me £1,000. £1,000! Did you say £1,000, Jimmy? I did, my son. I hope to God it's not a hoax, but put not your trust in princes or politicians, as the saying goes. Well, there it is. Owing to the way the manuscript had been following me around, I had no time to lose. It was a pity all the same. I'd just fixed up this trip to the interior, and I'd set my heart on going. I shan't get such a good chance again. You're incurable, Jimmy. £1,000 in the hand is worth a lot of mythical gold. And supposing it's a hoax. Anyway, here I am, passage booked and everything, on the way to Cape Town. And then you blow along. Anthony got up and lit up a cigarette. I begin to perceive your drift, James. You go gold hunting as planned, and I collect the £1,000 for you. How much do I get out of it? What do you say to a quarter? £250, free of income tax, as the saying goes. That's it. Done. And just to make you gnash your teeth, I'll tell you that I would have done it for 100. Let me tell you, James McGrath, you won't die in your bed counting up your bank balance. Anyway, it's a deal? It's a deal, all right. I'm on. And confusion to Castle's selectors. They drank the toast solemnly. That is the end of chapter 1. We're going to move on to chapter 2. And that's going to call it for today for this episode, and then I'll record the second episode right after. So here we go. Chapter 2. A Lady in Distress. So that's that, said Anthony, finishing off his glass and replacing it on the table. What boat were you going on? Granarth Castle. Passage is booked in your name, I suppose, so I'd better travel as James McGrath. We've outgrown the passport business, haven't we? No odds either way. You and I are totally unalike, but we'll probably have the same description on one of those blinking things. Height 6 feet, hair brown, eyes blue, nose ordinary, chin ordinary. Not so much of this ordinary stunt. Let me tell you that Castle selected me out of several applicants solely on account of my pleasing appearance and nice manners. Jimmy grinned. I noticed your manners this morning. The devil you did. Anthony rose and paced up and down the room. His brow was slightly wrinkled, and it was some minutes before he spoke. Jimmy, he said at last, Stilptich died in Paris. What's the point of sending a manuscript from Paris to London via Africa? Jimmy shook his head helplessly. I don't know. Why not do it up in some nice little parcel and send it by post? Sounds a damn right more sensible, I agree. Of course, continued Anthony, I know that kings and queens and government officials are prevented by etiquette from doing anything in a simple, straightforward fashion. Hence king's messengers and all that. In medieval days, you gave a fellow a signet ring as a sort of open sesame. The king's ring, pass, my lord, and it usually was the other fellow who had stolen it. I always wonder why some bright lad never hit on the expedient of copying the ring, making a dozen or so, and selling them at 100 ducats apiece. They seem to have no initiative in the Middle Ages. Jimmy yawned. My remarks on the Middle Ages don't seem to amuse you. Let's get back to Count Stilptich. From France to England via Africa seems a bit thick even for a diplomatic personage. If he merely wanted to ensure that you should get £1,000, he could have left it to you in his will. Thank God neither you nor I are too proud to accept a legacy. Stilptitch must have been balmy. You'd think so, wouldn't you? Anthony frowned and continued his pacing. Have you read the thing at all? He asked suddenly. Read what? The manuscript. Good Lord, no. What do you think I want to read a thing of that kind for? Anthony smiled. I just wondered, that's all. You know, a lot of trouble has been caused by memoirs, indiscreet revelations, that sort of thing. People who have been closed as an oyster all their lives seem positively to relish causing trouble when they themselves shall be comfortably dead. It gives them a kind of malicious glee. Jimmy, what sort of a man was Count Stilptitch? You met him and talked to him, and you're a pretty good judge of raw human nature. Can you imagine him being a vindictive old devil? Jimmy shook his head. It's difficult to tell. You see, the first night he was distinctly canned, and the next day he was just a high-toned old boy with the most beautiful manners, overwhelming me with compliments till I didn't know where to look. And he didn't say anything interesting when he was drunk? Jimmy cast his mind back, wrinkling his brows as he did so. He said he knew where the Koh-i-Noor was, he volunteered doubtfully. Oh, well, said Anthony, we all know that. They keep it in the tower, don't they? Behind a thick plate glass and iron bars, with a lot of gentlemen in fancy dress standing around to see you don't pinch anything. That's right, agreed Jimmy. Did Stilptitch say anything else of the same kind? That he knew which city the Wallace collection was in, for instance? Jimmy shook his head. Said Anthony. He lit another cigarette and once more began pacing up and down the room. You never read those papers, I suppose, you heathen, he threw out presently. Not very often, said McGrath simply. They're not about anything that interests me as a rule. Thank heaven I'm more civilized. There have been several mentions of Slovakia lately, hints at a royalist restoration. Nicholas IV didn't leave a son, said Jimmy, but I don't suppose for a minute that the Abolovitch dynasty is extinct. There probably are shoals of young'uns knocking about, cousins and second cousins and third cousins once removed. So that there wouldn't be any difficulty in finding a king. Not in the least, I should say, replied Jimmy. You know, I don't wonder at their getting tired of republican institutions. A full-blooded, virile people like that must find it awfully tame to pot at presidents after being used to kings. And talking of kings, that reminds me of something else old Stilptitch let out that night. He said he knew the gang that was after him. They were King Victor's people, he said. What? Anthony wheeled around suddenly. A slow grin widened on McGrath's face. Just a mite excited, aren't you, Gentleman Joe? He drawled. Don't be an ass, Jimmy. You've said something rather important. He went over to the window and stood there looking out. Who is this King Victor, anyway? Demanded Jimmy. Another Balkan monarch? No, said Anthony slowly. He isn't that kind of a king. Who is he, then? There was a pause. Then Anthony spoke. He's a crook, Jimmy, the most notorious jewel thief in the world. A fantastic, daring fellow, not to be daunted by anything. King Victor was the nickname he was known by in Paris. Paris was the headquarters of his gang. They caught him there and put him away for 7 years on a minor charge. They couldn't prove more important things against him. He'll be out soon, or he may be out already. Do you think Count Stilptitch had anything to do with putting him away? Was that why the gang went after him? For revenge? I don't know, Anthony said. It doesn't seem likely on the face of it. King Victor never stole the crown jewels of Slovakia, as far as I've heard. But the whole thing seems rather suggestive, doesn't it? The death of Stilptitch, the memoirs, the rumors in the papers, all vague but interesting. And there's a further rumor to the effect that they found oil in Slovakia. I've got a feeling in my bones, James, that people are getting ready to be interested in that unimportant little country. What sort of people? Financiers and city offices. What are you driving at with all this? Trying to make an easy job difficult, that's all. You can't pretend there's going to be any difficulty in handing over a simple manuscript at a publisher's office. No, said Anthony regretfully, I don't suppose there will be anything difficult about that. But I shall tell you, James, where I propose. But shall I tell you, James, where I propose to go with my £250? South America? No, my lad. Slovakia. I shall stand in with the Republic, I think. Very probably I shall end up as president. Why not announce yourself as the Principal Abolovich and be a king whilst you're at it? No, Jimmy, kings are for life. Presidents only take on the job for 4 years or so. It would quite amuse me to govern a kingdom like Slovakia for 4 years. The average for kings is even less, I should say, interpolated Jimmy. It will probably be a serious temptation to me to embezzle your share of the £1,000. You won't want it, you know, when you get back weighed down with nuggets. I'll invest it for you in Slovakian oil shares. You know, James, the more I think of it, the more pleased I am with this idea of yours. I should have never thought Slovakia if you hadn't mentioned it. I shall spend 1 day in London collecting the booty and then away by the Balkan Express. You won't get off quite as fast as that. I didn't mention it before, but I've got another little commission for you. Anthony sank into the chair and eyed him severely. I knew all along you were keeping something dark. This is where the catch comes in. Not a bit. It's just something that ought to be done, that's got to be done to help a lady. Once and for all, James, I refuse to be mixed up in your beastly love affairs. It's not a love affair. I've never seen the woman. I'll tell you the whole story. If I've got to listen to more of your long rambling stories, I shall have to have another drink. His host complied hospitably with this demand and began the tale. This was when I was in Uganda. There was a man whose life I had saved. If I were you, Jimmy, I should write a short book entitled Lives I've Saved. This is the second I've heard of this evening. Oh, well, I didn't really do anything this time, just pulled him out of the river. He couldn't swim. Wait a minute, has this story have anything to do with the other business? None whatsoever, though oddly enough, now I remember it, the man was Slovakian. We always called him Dutch Pedro, though. Anthony nodded indifferently. Any name's good enough, he remarked. Get on with the good work, James. Well, the fellow was sort of grateful about it, hung around like a dog. About 6 months later, he died of fever. I was with him, last thing, just as he was pegging out. He beckoned me and whispered some excited jargon about a secret, a gold mine, I thought he said. Shoved an oilskin packet into my hand, which he'd always worn next to his skin. Well, I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't until a week afterwards that I opened the packet. Then I was curious, I must confess. I shouldn't have thought that Dutch Pedro would have had the sense to know a gold mine when he saw it, but there's no accounting for luck. And at the mere thought of gold, your heart beat pitter-pat as always, interrupted Anthony. I was never so disgusted in my life. Gold mine indeed. I dare say it may have been a gold mine to him, the dirty dog. Do you know what it was? A woman's letters. Yes, a woman's letters. And an Englishwoman at that. The skunk had been blackmailing her, and he had the impudence to pass on his dirty bag of tricks to me. I like to see your righteous heat, James, but let me point out to you that... I think this is a racial commentary, so I'm going to skip it. He meant well. You had saved his life. He bequeathed you a profitable source of raising money. Your high-minded British ideals did not enter his horizon. Well, what the hell was I going to do with the things? Burn 'em? That's what I thought at first. Then it occurred to me that there would always be that poor dame not knowing they'd been destroyed and always living in a quake and a dread lest the man should turn up again one day. You've more imagination than I give you credit for, Jimmy, observed Anthony, lighting a cigarette. I admit that the case presented more difficulties than were first apparent. What about just sending them to her by post? Like all women, she'd put no date and no address on most of the letters. There was a kind of address on one, just one word, Chimneys. Anthony paused in the act of blowing out his match, and he dropped it with a quick jerk of his wrist as it burned his finger. Chimneys, he said. That's rather extraordinary. Why, do you know it? It's one of the stately homes of England, my dear James, a place where kings and queens go for weekends and diplomatists foregather and diplome. That's one of the reasons why I'm glad that you're going to England instead of me. You know all these things, said Jimmy simply. A josser like myself from the backwoods of Canada would be making all sorts of bloomers, but one of them But someone like you, who's been to Eton and Harrow, only one of them, said Anthony modestly, will be able to carry it through. Why didn't I send them to her, you say? Well, it seemed to me dangerous. From what I could make out, she seemed to have a jealous husband, since he opened the letter by mistake. Where would the poor dame... Oh, suppose he opened the letter by mistake. Where would the poor dame be then? Or she might be dead. The letters looked as though they'd been written some time ago. As I figured it out, the only thing was for someone to take them to England and put them into her own hands. Anthony threw away his cigarette, coming across to his friend and clapped him affectionately on the back. You're a real knight-errant, Jimmy, he said, and the backwoods of Canada should be proud of you. I shan't do the job half as prettily as you would. You'll take it on, then? Of course. McGrath rose, and going across to a drawer, took out a bundle of letters and threw them on the table. Here you are. You'd better have a look at them. Is it necessary? On the whole, I'd rather not. Well, from what you say about this Chimneys place, she may be staying there only. We'd better look through the letters and see if there's any clue as to where she really hangs out. I suppose you're right. They went through the letters carefully, but without finding what they had hoped to find. Anthony gathered them up. There we go. Gathered them up again thoughtfully. Poor little devil, he remarked. She was scared stiff. Jimmy nodded. Do you think you'll be able to find her all right? He asked anxiously. I won't leave England until I have. You're very concerned about this unknown lady, James. Jimmy ran his finger thoughtfully over the signature. It's a pretty name, he said apologetically. Virginia Revel. And that brings us to the end of chapter 2. So I am going to end it here, and you can look for the next video where we read chapters 3 and 4. Bye, guys.